Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're taking a trip way back into deep time. But we're not just looking at the clock, we're looking at the evolutionary rulebook and watching it get torn up,
Yeah, we're tackling a really fundamental question in paleontology, maybe even a chilling one.
which is, when a global catastrophe hits, why do the very traits that made species successful for millions of years suddenly just fail?
And to explore that, we're diving into a really key paper. It's Jablonski's 1989 work, The Biology of Mass Extinction, a paleontological view.
A classic.
Definitely, it really shifted the focus
Right.
away from just what caused mass extinctions to digging deep into who survived and critically why.
So our mission for you today is to unpack Jablonski's core idea. Extinction isn't biologically random, no. But during a massive crisis, the rules of the game, the selective filters, they completely change.
Right, it becomes what he termed non-constructive selectivity.
Non-constructive. That sounds counterintuitive for evolution.
It is, in a way. It means selection isn't necessarily favoring, like, better competitors or more efficient organisms, the stuff Darwinian selection usually rewards.
Yeah.
Instead, survival might hinge on almost arbitrary traits that just happen to offer resistance to whatever that specific massive global shock is.
Like maybe it's not about being the fittest, but just being lucky enough to be somewhere else when the disaster hits.
Precisely. If your genus survives a giant impact, maybe it wasn't because you outcompeted everyone, but just because you happen to have populations in an ocean basin that was less severely affected. Geography is destiny almost.
Okay, so to understand how the rules change, we need to know what the rules were. What worked during normal times, during background extinction. That's most of Earth's history, right?
Exactly, the vast majority. Background extinction is that slow, constant turnover. Think competition, local climate shifts, maybe new predators appearing, the usual grind.
And paleontologists, looking mainly at things like mollusks from the late Cretaceous, had figured out a couple of key traits that seemed to help genera survive this background hum.
That's right, two big ones stood out.
Okay, what's the first?
First was species richness. Pretty straightforward. Generally, those groups of related species that had more species tended to last longer.
Okay, that makes intuitive sense. Like if you're a genus with 10 species scattered about, losing one or two to some local problem doesn't wipe out the whole group. It's like having evolutionary backup.
Exactly. An insurance policy. The second trait was having widespread species.
Meaning the individual species within the genus were found over large areas.
Yes, or they had larvae that could disperse really far. Species with broad geographical ranges tended to be geologically longer-lived, and that resilience at the species level boosted the survival chances of the whole genus.
Right. So diversity and being spread out, good strategies against local problems and the normal pressures, seemed reliable for millions of years.
They were, until they weren't. And Jablonski used the ultimate stress test to show when these reliable rules break down. The end Cretaceous mass extinction, the big one. The KT, or KPG, event. He looked specifically at the fossil record of bivalves and gastropods from the North American coastal plain, right across that boundary.
Okay, the asteroid impact.
Yeah. And the question was, did being species rich or having widespread species still help you survive that?
And this is the core finding, the real bombshell on the paper, isn't it?
It really is. A total failure of the background rules.
When the catastrophe hit, those traits, richness, species range, they just didn't matter anymore.
Statistically, no. They offered basically zero advantage in predicting which genera made it through the end Cretaceous event.
Let's put some numbers on that because it's pretty stark. For the bivalves.
Okay, for bivalves, the survival rate for genera that were species-rich before the event was about 47%.
Okay. And for the species poor genera?
It was 45%.
47 versus 45, that's nothing. Statistically identical.
Exactly. The advantage of being diverse. Gone. Wiped out in the crisis.
Wow. And the gastropods, the snails, were even weirder?
Even weirder. For the coastal plain gastropods, not only did having many species not help, the pattern actually flipped. Significantly fewer species-rich gastropod genera survived compared to the species-poor ones.
Wait, fewer? So the strategy that worked in normal times actually became a disadvantage?
Or at least offered no protection, maybe even a liability. It's a complete reversal.
Why would that happen? Why would being diverse suddenly hurt your chances?
Well, think about what high species richness often implies during background times. It might mean lots of specialization, right? Refining niches, becoming really efficient in a stable ecosystem.
Okay.
But when the entire global system collapses practically overnight, impact winter, food chains going in, That high specialization might become a trap. You're perfectly adapted to a world that just vanished.
Whereas the less diverse, maybe more generalized genera.
They might have had broader tolerances or maybe just lower metabolic demands. They weren't so tightly wired into that complex, now broken system.
Okay, so if the species-level traits, the things that made sense for competition like richness, didn't count, the selection must have shifted focus entirely. What did predict survival during the mass extinction?
It jumped up a level. The key factor became geographical range at the clade level. So not the range of individual species, but the overall geographic spread of the entire genus, the whole group.
So it wasn't about how widespread your individual species were within, say, the Gulf Coast, but whether your genus also existed way outside that affected region, like in Europe or the Pacific.
Exactly that. The scale shifted from local regional species distribution to global genus distribution.
And the data for the North American mollusks showed this clearly.
Very clearly, genera that were endemic, meaning they only lived in that coastal plain region, got hammered. Only about 9% of endemic bivalve genera survived.
9%.
Compare that to genera that also had populations outside the coastal plain. Their survival rate was around 55%.
55 versus 9, that's a massive difference. Being geographically restricted was basically a death sentence.
It seems to be a recurring theme in mass extinctions. We see similar patterns in endemic groups suffering disproportionately in the End Ordovician, the late Devonian, and Permian, across different groups too, like trilobites. Global spread becomes the ultimate insurance policy when the threat is also global.
So the filter changes from how complex and diverse are you internally to how spread out are you externally. That's fascinating. Were there other, maybe more subtle selective factors Jablonski pointed out?
Yeah, he mentioned some interesting parallels, like work on Paleozoic bryozoans, those little colonial filter feeders. The ones with complex skeletons, likely the specialists, often species-rich, they actually had lower extinction rates during background times. They were winning the normal competition.
But during mass extinctions,
They suffered greater losses. Again, complexity and specialization, great for normal times, became liabilities when the world changed drastically.
and you also touched on tropical life potentially being more vulnerable.
Yes, there's evidence suggesting that tropical marine organisms often suffer disproportionately during mass extinctions, maybe more than you'd expect, just based on their high initial diversity.
Why might that be?
It could tie back to that specialization idea. Tropical ecosystems are incredibly complex, full of intricate relationships and often many endemic species. They might just be more brittle, more susceptible to collapsing when hit by a huge, sudden shock like rapid cooling or a total disruption of the food web.
It's important to stress, though, that this doesn't mean natural selection just switched off entirely, right? It just changed its criteria.
Absolutely. Selection was still operating, but the pressures were different. Some traits might have offered a kind of pre-adaptation to the specific conditions of the KT crisis.
Like what?
Well, for example, some types of planktonic diatoms that survived seemed to have the ability to form a resting stage, dropping out of the plankton. That could have helped them weather the collapse of the surface ocean ecosystem when sunlight was blocked.
So a specific trick for that specific crisis.
Exactly. Or maybe being a deposit feeder, eating muck on the seafloor, was better than being a filter feeder when the plankton disappeared. These are survival traits geared towards the catastrophe itself, not traits honed over millions of years of competition.
Okay, so let's talk consequences. If mass extinctions operate with this non-constructive selectivity, filtering by geography or weird pre-adaptations rather than competitive success, what does that do to the long-term story of evolution?
It's profoundly disruptive. Mass extinctions don't just speed up existing trends, they fundamentally redirect evolution by wiping out clades that were, by all normal measures, incredibly successful, innovative, and well-adapted.
They prune the tree of life based on criteria that are irrelevant most of the time.
Right. And this creates huge evolutionary bottlenecks. It removes adaptations and lineages that might have otherwise dominated or led to further innovations.
And we can actually see examples of successful adaptations getting wiped out, only to reappear much, much later.
Yes. Jablonski gives some striking examples. Take predatory drilling in gastropods, snails drilling holes in shells.
Yeah, a pretty sophisticated trick.
A natacation lineage evolved this in the late Triassic. Highly successful. But that lineage got wiped out in the end Triassic extinction. The drilling habit vanished from that group.
And when did it come back?
A completely different group of natacations re-evolved the same drilling ability 120 million years later.
Wow. 120 million years of lost evolutionary trajectory just because the original innovators were in the wrong place or lacked the right survival trait for that specific crisis.
It's a huge setback. Another example, rock boring in metalloid bivalves, like mussels. They figured out how to bore into rock back in the late Ordovician. A great adaptation.
Yeah.
The whole lineage was lost in the end Ordovician extinction. Rock-boring bivalves didn't show up again until the Triassic period. That's a gap of maybe 200 million years.
So mass extinctions can just erase successful innovations simply due to bad luck of geography or specialization.
Exactly, and this leads to what Jablonski calls preemptive replacement. The dominant groups get removed, not necessarily because they were outcompeted, but because they failed the extinction filter. This opens up ecological space for groups that were previously minor players.
Like the classic examples. The therapsids, the mammal-like reptiles, largely replaced by dinosaurs after the end Permian and end Triassic events, and then dinosaurs replaced by mammals after the end Cretaceous.
Right. It wasn't necessarily that mammals were better than dinosaurs in the late Cretaceous, but they happened to have the traits, maybe small size, generalized diets, maybe endothermy helped, that let them squeak through the KT catastrophe, while the non-avian dinosaurs didn't. Survival first, dominance later.
And the survivors, even if they weren't the best before the event, then set the course for future evolution.
They do. Their survival can lock in certain traits or body plans. Jablonski mentions echinoids, sea urchins. The survival of just one group, the Myosidarids, through the devastating Permo-Triassic extinction, basically fixed the template, the plating pattern, for almost all future sea urchins.
So all later urchin evolution was constrained by the architecture of the survivors, not necessarily the optimal architecture overall.
Exactly. It all reinforces that central idea.
Yeah.
A group's ability to resist mass extinction isn't fixed. It depends on whether the traits favored during long stretches of background time, like high species richness, happen to align with the traits needed for surviving a rare catastrophic event like broad geographic range. Often, they don't align at all.
It really underscores that evolution isn't just a smooth, gradual climb. These massive, rare events impose a completely different selective regime.
They're powerful disruptions that reset the board, undermining the rules established over the preceding millions of years. The failure of traits like species richness really highlights the sheer scale and unique nature of these events.
Some might argue extinctions exist on a spectrum, a continuum of severity.
They do, but Jablonski's point is that even if it's a continuum, for a typical successful clade honed by background selection, a mass extinction represents a threshold, a point where the rules abruptly change, and previously successful strategies become ineffective almost instantly.
Which brings us to a final thought for you, our listeners. Jablonski argues evolution gets channeled in directions you just couldn't predict by looking only at the normal times. Think about the ammonites' incredibly diverse, complex shells, dominant cephalopods for hundreds of millions of years.
All gone at the KT boundary.
While the much simpler, less diverse ancient nautilus lineage survived. It survived that catastrophe, and it's still with us today.
A living fossil, essentially.
So, if the most successful complex groups can be wiped out by these unpredictable events, while simpler or geographically lucky ones survive, can we ever really know what traits, what Jablonski called the other criteria, will truly matter in the face of future, potentially unforeseen global crises?
It's a sobering question. Are we, as a global civilization, reliant on complex specialized systems, inadvertently selecting for traits that excel in background conditions, but offer little resilience against a truly catastrophic, non-constructive shock? Something to ponder.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.